The wind that came down off Dagger Ridge had no official name on any government survey map, but the men who had worked the silver and copper mines of Colfax County called it the widow's breath. Not because it was gentle, because it was patient. It came from the north, from peaks that had no names worth remembering, and it moved across the high country with the particular indifference of something that had outlasted everything it had ever touched. Stone, timber. Men who believed their own strength was enough. Wren Calloway had been on the mountain for 3 days before she understood the name. She had thought she understood cold. She had grown up on the Kansas plains, where winter arrived flat and merciless across open ground with nothing to slow it. But the cold on Dagger Ridge was a different creature entirely. It had weight. It pressed down through the canvas of her tent, through the wool of her coat, through the skin of her hands until she could feel it sitting against the bone itself, patient, specific, entirely without malice. That was the worst of it. There was no cruelty in it. The mountain simply did not notice her. Below her, 400 feet down the switchback trail, the town of Caldera Flats sat in its shallow basin like a collection of matchsticks someone had dropped without care. 43 buildings, a main street with a name no one used, a bank with a painted sign that caught the morning light in a way that was almost cheerful. She had stood in front of that bank 11 days ago, in the middle of October 1883, while a man with a gavel sold the iron pot she had carried from Missouri in the back of a wagon. 75 cents for the pot. $1.20 for the quilt she had sewn during the first winter of her marriage when the nights were long enough for that kind of patience. 50 cents for the mirror from the bedroom wall. Wren had not watched the mirror go. She had watched the numbers, instead adding them in her head the way her mother, her real mother, the one who died of fever in a rooming house in Abilene when Wren was 6, had taught her to do with whatever small coins came through. Her mother had believed in counting, in knowing exactly where you stood, even when where you stood was nowhere good. Dale Calloway had not believed in counting. Dale had believed in the next find, the next season, the next strike that was always 6 weeks away in the hills above Caldera Flats. He was not a dishonest man. She had loved him for exactly the qualities that destroyed them both: the width of his hope, the ease of his laugh, the way he could look at a played-out hillside and see something no one else could see. He had been wrong every time. Wrong in a way that cost them the house, the furniture, the wagon, and finally on a February morning in 1882, his own life, a lung that had taken too much cold and too much dust and simply stopped cooperating. She had buried him herself. The ground was still half frozen, and the sexton was sick with the same fever that had been working through the lower valley, so she borrowed a pickaxe from the livery stable and went up to the hill above town where the graves were and worked until she had a hole deep enough to be decent. It took most of a day. Her hands bled through 2 pairs of gloves. No one came to help. No one came to watch. She said the words she could remember from the service she had attended as a child, covered him over, and walked back down to the house that was already technically the property of Voss Lending. Harlan Voss had given her 18 months. She had understood at the time that this was not kindness but calculation. A widow in a small territory town generated a certain amount of social friction if pressed too hard too fast. He had waited until the friction dissipated, until people had moved on to other concerns, until Wren herself had become simply part of the landscape, the quiet woman in the house on Sycamore Street, who took in mending and did not ask for help. Then he had come to her door on a Tuesday morning in September with 2 men from his office, a sheaf of papers, and a tone of practiced regret. The auction had been the following Thursday. What remained when it was over $11.40 in a tobacco tin. The clothes she was wearing, and 2 changes beside. A small trunk with Dale's few personal effects. A pair of boots, 1 size too large, that had been overlooked somehow in the inventory. The deed to a parcel of land on Dagger Ridge called Devil's Notch, which had belonged to Dale's uncle, a solitary, difficult man named Crockett, who had worked a claim up there for years and died without telling anyone what he had found, or not found, or suspected. The deed was worthless. Everyone in Caldera Flats could have told her that, and several of them tried. Devil's Notch was a standing joke in the county, 40 acres of exposed granite and stunted scrub oak. No water, no soil worth the name, nothing growing on it that a man could eat or sell. Crockett had been the punchline of a dozen conversations over the years. What's a fool's claim, Devil's Notch? What do you call a man who works stone for 30 years and dies with empty pockets? Old Crockett. Harlan Voss had come to her that same evening, the evening of the auction, while the smell of strangers in her house still hung in the rooms, and offered her $50 for the deed. He had dressed carefully for the visit. The vest was brushed. The boots were clean. He held his hat in both hands at the door like a man practicing at humility, and his voice carried the particular warmth of someone who has decided in advance that this conversation will go his way. $50 is more than that land will ever produce, he told her, his tone shaped like generosity. You could be in Santa Fe by Christmas or back east entirely. Start fresh somewhere with people who know you. Wren looked at him for a long moment. She was 31 years old, 5 feet 4 inches, with dark red hair that she kept pinned back out of practicality, gray-blue eyes that Dale had once compared to the color of the sky, just before it decided what kind of day it meant to have, and hands that were already rougher than most women's from the months of taking in whatever work Caldera Flats had to offer. She was not an impressive figure. She had never tried to be. What she saw in Harlan Voss's face was not generosity. It was the particular stillness of a man waiting for a door to open that he has already decided will open. No, nothing before it, nothing after. Something crossed his face so quickly she might have imagined it, a tightening around the eyes, a fraction of a second where the performance slipped. Then the warmth came back, practice seamless. The winter on Dagger Ridge is not a thing to be trifled with, Mrs. Calloway. Think carefully. His voice remained pleasant. The warning inside it was dressed well enough that a less careful woman might have missed it entirely. She did not miss it. She watched him walk back down the street toward the bank, standing in the doorway of a house that no longer belonged to her, thinking about the fact that Harlan Voss, a man who had built a lending business on never spending money he did not expect to recover tenfold, had just offered $50 for a piece of land the entire county treated as a cautionary tale. She did not sleep much that night, but in the morning she went to the general store. Gideon Marsh ran the store the way he ran most things, quietly without drawing attention, watching the corners of the room more than the center. He was a good man, pressed thin by circumstances. His wife's medical bills from 2 years ago still outstanding at the bank, a debt that Harlan Voss held with the particular patience of someone who valued leverage more than repayment. When Wren set her list on the counter canvas, sheeting, a shovel, a pickaxe, a mallet, a hand drill, rope rice, dried beans, salt pork, lamp oil, matches, and a tin of coffee, that was more luxury than necessity, but that she bought anyway. Gideon did not ask questions. He wrote the numbers down, took her $11 and some cents, and counted back the change with care. He said nothing when she was turning to go. She heard him exhale, not a sigh, exactly more, the sound a man makes when he is watching something he cannot stop and has decided not to embarrass himself by trying. She loaded the pack herself, shouldered it, and walked up through town without looking at the bank. The trail up Dagger Ridge was not so much a trail as an argument with the mountain, a suggestion in the rock that something with 2 legs had passed this way before winding through gorse and low scrub oak, whose branches reached out across the path with the indiscriminate hostility of something that had never been pruned or reasoned with. The pack weighed close to 40 pounds. By the time she reached the flat shelf of rock that marked the lower boundary of Devil's Notch, her shoulders had moved past burning into a deep structural ache that she recognized as the kind that would still be present in 3 days. She stood at the edge of the property and looked at what Dale's uncle had left behind. The land was exactly as described and worse in person. Granite broke through the thin skin of soil, every few feet gray and absolute. The scrub oak grew in twisted clusters, shaped by decades of the widow's breath, into forms that leaned uniformly south like men, all looking away from the same thing. At the center of the property stood the ruin of a miner's shelter. Low stone walls that had mostly given up their vertical ambition, a collapsed roofline buried under years of weather and moss, the whole thing settling gradually back into the rock it had been pulled from. The wind hit her and the ridgeline with a force that was almost conversational. Here I am, it seemed to say, here I have always been. She pitched the tent in the most sheltered spot she could identify, a depression on the south side of the ruined walls, where the rock broke the worst of the wind. It took 2 hours because the ground pegs would not set in stone, and she had to loop the ropes through gaps in the fallen wall instead. When the tent was finally standing, if standing was the right word for the way it moved, the canvas, snapping and pulling at every gust, she crawled inside, ate a cold handful of dried rice because she was too tired to build a fire, and lay on the ground with her coat pulled over her. The first night was an education in what the word cold actually contained. She had understood cold as a temperature. On Dagger Ridge in late October, she understood it as a process. It came through the canvas, through her coat, through the blanket she had wrapped around her shoulders, through the thin separation between her body and the rock beneath. It was not dramatic, it was incremental. It worked from the outside in degree by degree, like water finding its way through stone, not forcing, just persistent. She did not sleep so much as endure the hours until gray light came through the canvas. The second day she spent gathering what little fuel the land offered. The scrub oak burned hot but fast. Dead branches were scarce. A full day of bending and searching and breaking and carrying produced a bundle that would last perhaps 3 hours in a small fire. She sat by the coals that evening doing arithmetic that did not come out to a livable number. There was not enough wood on this mountain to carry her through a winter. Not even close. The third day she began to clear the ruin. Her intention was practical. She wanted to know what the original builders had used for flooring, whether there was buried timber, anything combustible that might have been protected from weather by the weight of the collapsed walls above. The stones were heavy, some of them impossibly so, for one person to move without assistance. But she had watched mule skinners at the livery work principles of leverage, without ever naming them as such, and she had learned from watching. A long piece of scrub oak as a bar, a smaller stone as the fulcrum patience in place of strength. The large stones moved. Not easily, not quickly, but they moved. She was 3 hours into the work, her hands wrapped in strips torn from an old shirt, because her palms had already given up their first layer of skin when she shifted a flat granite slab about 4 feet across and felt something that stopped her entirely. Air. It came up from the gap she had opened, a slow, quiet exhalation from the darkness below, and it was not the same temperature as the air scraping across her face. It was not warm, she would not have called it warm, but it was measurably, undeniably less cold. The difference between what hit her cheeks and what rose from that dark opening was the difference between iron and wood, both hard, but one of them carrying something the other did not. She pressed her cheek close to the gap. The smell came up with the air, earth, mineral, damp stone, the particular darkness of a space that had not moved in a long time. She held still and breathed it in and said nothing because there was no one to say anything to. The memory that surfaced was specific and clear, the way only a few memories ever are sharp-edged, carrying its own light. Ruth Calloway sitting beside the iron stove in the farmhouse outside Abilene on a December evening, hands wrapped around a mug, speaking in the particular register she used when she was passing something along rather than simply talking. Ruth had taken Wren out of the Abilene County Children's Home when Wren was 7 years old for reasons Ruth never fully explained, and Wren eventually stopped needing explained. Ruth was a woman who had farmed 40 acres alone for 11 years after her husband broke his neck, falling from a barn roof, who planted by moon cycles and kept her root cellar stocked with a year's provisions and could read weather in the behavior of her chickens 3 days before it arrived. She was not educated in any formal sense. She was competent in ways that formal education rarely produced. The ground holds summer like a closed fist, Ruth had said that December evening, watching the snow come sideways past the window. Sun goes down in September, but the heat doesn't follow it, not right away, not deep down. Below the freeze line, it just sits there waiting. You dig down far enough in January, you'll find October still there in the dirt. Wren had been 9 or 10. She had understood it as fact without understanding what it meant. Now kneeling on a granite shelf in the last days of October 1883, her cheek near a gap in the earth from which something warmer than the air above was breathing, she understood what it meant. She sat back on her heels. The wind moved through the scrub oak behind her with a sound like something being dragged across stone. Every structure she had ever lived in had been built the same way up. Walls, raised roof set, windows faced outward fire, built to fight the cold that the walls could not fully stop. The cold always won eventually. It found the gaps in the window frames, the space under the door, the thin places in the plaster. Every house she had known spent its winter in a state of siege, burning fuel as fast as it could be fed in. The warmth produced always slightly less than the cold pressing against every surface. What if the cold was coming from the wrong direction? What if the floor was the ceiling of something warmer and no one was building below it because no one thought to look down? The idea was absurd. She was aware it was absurd. She was also aware that she had $11 before the auction, now had fewer. Owned a tent that moved in the wind like a man trying not to fall. Had perhaps 2 weeks of food, had no timber for a cabin, no money to buy timber, no neighbors close enough to matter. one enemy in the valley below who was waiting for the mountain to solve his problem for him, and an empty winter stretching out ahead of her that would kill her as surely as a bullet if she met it the way everyone expected her to. The absurdity of an idea was not the same as its wrongness. She sat for a long time with her back against the cold stone of the ruined wall and thought it through. The original shelter's builders had dug down several feet to set the foundation. The evidence was still visible in the depression, the way the floor of the ruins sat lower than the surrounding rock. She would start there. She would not build on the land. She would build into it. She would dig the depression deeper, extend it back into the slope, use the hillside itself as three of her four walls, and the insulating weight of the earth above as her roof. The stones from the ruin would become the front wall and doorframe. The flat granite slab she was already uncovering would become the roof laid across the top and buried under dirt and turf. The mountain's own mass would do what no amount of firewood could hold: a steady temperature, against which a small fire needed to work only a little. It was the plan of a burrowing animal. She knew exactly what they would call her in town when word spread, because word always spread, because there was nothing else to talk about in a settlement of 43 buildings in November. Let them. She pulled the small piece of leather she used as a writing surface from inside her coat, found the stub of pencil she kept there, and began to draw. Not with any architectural precision, she had none, but with the logic of a woman who had helped build a sod house at 16, who had watched her husband dig drainage channels for 3 seasons, who understood that everything built to last was built first in the head, measured against what was actually available, and revised until it matched reality rather than hope. The drawing took an hour. When she was done, she looked at it in the fading afternoon light. It looked like a wound cut into the side of the hill. It looked, she supposed, like a grave. She folded it carefully, pressed it flat against her chest inside her coat where it would stay dry, and began to rebuild the fire for the evening. The smoke went sideways in the wind. The scrub oak burned fast. The cold came back within minutes of the last coals dying. But for the first time since February, since she had stood alone at a frozen grave on a hill above Caldera Flats and said words she only half remembered to a man she had fully loved, she felt something that was not grief or fear or the particular grinding fatigue of a life reduced to its minimum requirements. She felt like she knew something other people did not. It was a small warmth, not much different from the breath she had felt coming up from the earth. Not dramatic, not enough to make a speech about, but real and specifically hers, and it did not go out when the fire did. She pulled her coat tighter and watched the darkness come down over Dagger Ridge, and did not once look at the trail that led back to Caldera Flats. The work began before dawn on the 4th day, when the sky above Dagger Ridge was still the color of a bruise fading at the edges. Wren built a small fire, ate a fistful of cold beans from the pot she had left covered overnight, drank water that had developed a thin skin of ice, pulled on every layer she owned, and walked the 12 steps from the tent to the depression at the center of the ruined shelter. She stood over it for a moment, the gap she had opened in the earth, still breathing its faint mineral warmth up into the cold air. Then she picked up the shovel and drove it into the ground. The first foot was punishment. The frost-hardened soil turned the shovel blade with a sound like a hammer strike, jarring through her palms and up into the tendons of her forearms. She switched to the pickaxe, working the frozen skin loose in chunks, prying up stones that had no intention of moving, convincing them through repetition rather than force. An hour of this produced a shallow widening of the existing depression, perhaps 8 inches deeper, 2 feet wider. She looked at what she had done, then looked at the hillside still ahead of her, the mass of rock and earth and time that she meant to hollow out, and made a deliberate choice not to calculate how long it would take. Calculation was useful for problems with clean edges. This was not that kind of problem. This was the kind that required not thinking about the whole of it, only the next foot of depth, the next stone, the next hour. Below the frost line reached on the 2nd day of digging at roughly 18 inches, the soil changed. It was still dense, still threaded through with rock, but it moved differently under the pickaxe. Less like iron, more like reluctant clay. The temperature of the earth around the excavation was measurably different from the air above. She could feel it against her forearms when she reached down to pull debris out by hand. Not warm by any standard a comfortable person would recognize, but stable, consistent. The earth was not heating or cooling with the wind the way the air above was. It had made its thermal decision months ago and was simply holding it. This, she understood, was the entire theory. The earth had made its decision. She was asking to live inside that decision. By the end of the first week, her hands had moved through 3 stages. The blisters had come first, risen on the second day, wept on the third, hardened into something tougher than the original skin by the fifth. She wrapped them at night in strips of cloth, dampened with a little of the salt pork brine, which Ruth had once told her was better for toughening skin than any remedy a doctor would sell. The wrapping helped. The hands continued to hurt, but productively the kind of pain that signals work accomplished rather than damage ongoing. Her back was a separate conversation. She had not known how much of her daily life had been structured around avoiding certain movements until she was performing those movements 12 hours a day. The twist of lifting a full shovel load, the repeated overhand swing of the pickaxe, the hunched hours of fitting smaller stones into gaps by hand, each motion had a corresponding muscle that was not accustomed to being consulted so frequently. By the end of each day, she moved back to the tent with the particular deliberateness of someone navigating around their own body. She slept immediately and completely the way people sleep when the body has spent everything and left nothing for the mind to work with. Ezra Pruitt appeared on a Tuesday, or what she believed was Tuesday. She had lost precise track by then, marking days by sleep rather than date. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps on the loose rock above the excavation, the sound of someone moving carefully rather than quietly, a man who did not want to startle her, rather than a man who wanted to go unheard. She did not stop working. When she straightened to pull a stone free from the far wall, she found him standing at the upper edge of the pit, looking down at what she had created. He was older than she had expected, somewhere north of 60, with the particular weathering that came from decades at altitude. Beard gone mostly silver, kept short in a practical way. A canvas coat that had been mended in 4 visible places. Eyes the color of strong coffee that moved over her excavation with an expression she could not immediately classify. Not dismissal, not pity, something more like an engineer reading blueprints in an unfamiliar language. She went back to work. He stood there for perhaps 10 minutes without speaking. She was aware of his presence the way you are aware of weather, as a fact of the environment rather than an intrusion. Then she heard him come down into the pit behind her, heard him pick something up, heard the particular sound of a long piece of wood being seated against a rock as a lever. "The fulcrum goes here." His voice had the texture of ground that had absorbed a lot of weather. He was not talking to her so much as to the problem. "Shorter end against the stone. Put your weight on the long end, not your back." She looked at the setup. It was different from what she had been doing, the fulcrum positioned further from the stone than she had placed it, which changed the mechanical ratio in a way that was immediately obvious when she thought about it. She tried it. The stone she had been working on for 40 minutes moved on the first attempt, a long granite groan of displacement, rolling clear of the wall it had been pressed against. Ezra looked at the result. He did not say anything affirming. He picked up the piece of wood he had used as a lever, set it back where he had found it, and climbed out of the pit. She listened to his footsteps diminish down the slope. The following week, she found a sack of potatoes at the bottom of the trail where it met the main path. No note. The potatoes were good, firm, dry, clearly from a proper root cellar rather than improvised storage. Alongside them was a pair of leather work gloves, stiff with newness, the kind of gloves built for people who intended to use their hands against material that pushed back. She put the gloves on. The difference in what she could accomplish with protected hands compared to wrapped ones was the difference between managing a situation and solving it. The work accelerated. The excavation was now 8 feet deep into the slope, 10 feet wide, with the 2 side walls packed earth and stone forming a natural corridor leading to the intact hillside at the back. Wren began the front wall. This was a different kind of work from digging. Digging required persistence. Walling required attention, the ability to look at a stone, understand its geometry, find where it wanted to sit, place it in a way that its weight worked with the wall rather than against it. She had watched dry stone walls on the high ground above Abilene, as a girl had even helped rebuild one section of Ruth's pasture fence after a mule worked a corner post loose. The principle came back to her in the hands rather than the head, which was the only way useful knowledge ever really lived. The first 3 courses of her front wall were mediocre. Too much gap, too little interlocking of adjacent stones. She pulled the top 2 courses down twice before she found the rhythm of it, the understanding that each stone was not an individual choice, but a part of a conversation with every stone already placed. The wall grew slowly, a foot a day on good days. half that when the stones she needed were buried or wrong-shaped or simply refused to sit the way she needed them to. She was fitting a particularly difficult cornerstone on a gray Wednesday morning when she heard hoofbeats below on the main trail. She straightened, looked down the slope, and saw Harlan Voss picking his way up on a sorrel horse, his coat dark against the pale rock. He was alone. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who had decided the destination was already his. He drew up at the edge of the excavation. Whatever he had expected to find a woman half frozen, a collapsed tent evidence of imminent surrender, it was clearly not this. The pit was 12 feet deep now. The front wall stood 3 feet high along a 12-foot span. The excavated stones were sorted by size along the uphill side, organized with a system that was apparent even to a man looking down from horseback. Still at it? Not a question. His voice had dropped the warmth it carried in town. Up here with no audience, there was less incentive for performance. Wren set the cornerstone without looking up. It seated almost right, she would need to shim the left side with a flat chip. Still at it, her voice carrying exactly the weight of the words, nothing more. He surveyed the excavation the way a man surveys a card game where someone else is holding a hand he cannot see. You understand that what you're building won't pass a winter. Stone without mortar falls, earth caves. You'll be inside it when it does. She selected the chip she needed, pressed it into the gap below the cornerstone, tested the stability with her palm. Solid. Thank you for the concern. The specific texture of his silence told her he had not come up here for conversation. He had come to assess. She kept her back to him, working the next stone into position, letting the silence sit between them for as long as it needed to. I'll raise my offer to $75, he said at last, given the season. She fit the stone into place. It locked against the cornerstone with a sound like a quiet confirmation. No. More silence. The horse moved on the loose rock. You're a stubborn woman, Mrs. Calloway. She turned, then looked up at him directly, her hands on the wall she had built. I'm aware of what I am, Mr. Voss. Nothing else needed to follow that, so she let it stand alone. He held her gaze for a moment. She had the impression of something being rapidly recalculated behind his eyes, some set of numbers that were not coming out the way they had before he rode up the mountain. Then he turned the horse without another word, picking his way back down the slope with the same unhurried precision with which he had arrived. She watched him until he was out of sight below the tree line. Then she turned back to the wall. The visit changed the tempo of something she could not name precisely. Before it, the work had been simply the work, her against the mountain, the cold, her own limitations. After it, there was a new layer beneath the labor. She was building against a clock she could not see toward a deadline set by someone else's patience. The work did not change, but the meaning of finishing changed. Finishing was no longer survival alone. Finishing was the only argument that mattered. She began to work longer hours. The front wall reached full height, 6 feet, with a rough lintel stone across the door opening on a Friday in early November, 3.5 weeks after she had first driven the shovel into frozen ground. She ran her hand along the top course, feeling the interlocked solidity of it, the way the stones had stopped being individual objects and become a single thing. It was not beautiful work. It was not the work of a craftsman with years behind their hands. But it would stand. The roof presented a different category of problem. She had no timber. The scrub oak on the hillside grew in diameters too small for structural use, and she could not afford cut lumber even if she had been willing to make that trip into Caldera Flats, which she was not until the wall was done. The solution she had arrived at, the only solution available, was flat granite slabs laid across the top of the walls like a series of bridges, then buried under a thick layer of excavated soil with turf on top. Structurally sound in theory, catastrophic in execution if a slab shifted during placement. The slabs she needed were already present on the site. The original collapsed roof had used exactly this technique, which was part of why the walls had survived the decades of neglect even after the roof failed. Her version would have no mortar to fail. Moving the first slab took the better part of a day. She used a log roller system, multiple round sections of wood laid parallel under the slab, allowing it to be rolled rather than dragged. The problem was that the slab had to travel uphill to reach the wall position, which meant the roller system worked against her on every inch of elevation gain. She built a ramp of packed earth on the uphill side and used a doubled rope looped over a rock outcrop above as a brake on the downhill side to keep the slab from reversing. Progress was measurable in fractions of feet per hour. She had the third slab in motion, being levered 6 inches off the ground when the rope she was using as a guideline gave way. The failure was at a frayed section she had checked twice, but apparently not closely enough. A sharp crack, almost polite in its brevity, and then everything happened at once. The slab dropped. She had been standing where the mechanics of the system required her to be, and the drop kicked the lever arm upward, which struck her left shoulder, with the full translation of several hundred pounds of falling granite expressed through 6 feet of hardwood. The impact threw her sideways into the wall of the excavation. She hit the packed earth and went down. She lay on the ground and took inventory before trying to move. The shoulder sang with pain but moved when she asked it, to bruised, not broken. The slab had come to rest on the far edge of the roof opening, held by the wall edge and the soil bank at the back. She looked up at the underside of it, now resting at an angle above her. Her chest was moving, her hands were intact. The wall was still standing. She lay on the packed earth for a long time without moving. The cold of the ground came up through her coat. Above the edge of the excavation, the November sky was the color of old pewter, flat and close. The wind moved through the scrub oak at the rim. She was aware in a way she had not been before of how completely alone the mountain made a person. Not as complaint, but as simple fact. The way altitude was a fact, the way the cold was a fact. She was also aware with a clarity that she had not expected and could not entirely account for, that she wanted to finish. Not because of Harlan Voss, not because of what the town thought or said or would say. She wanted to finish because the thing she was building deserved to be finished, because it was true, and the truth of it mattered regardless of whether anyone else ever understood it. She sat up slowly, got to her feet, looked at the slab, and figured out a way to reset the guideline with a better anchor point. The morning she set the fifth and final roof slab into position, a cold front moved through overnight and left 2 inches of snow on the ground by dawn. She stood at the edge of the excavation and looked at the near-invisible line where her roof met the hillside. The turf she had laid over the packed soil had already taken on a dusting of white, making the whole structure nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding slope. If you did not know what you were looking for, you would walk right past it. She went inside to check the seals. The interior was dim, lit by a single candle she had carried in from the tent. The 5 granite slabs above her head showed their joints gaps she had filled with smaller stones and clay dug from the lower hillside, which had set hard as the temperature dropped. She ran her fingers along the ceiling joints. Dry. The back wall where the excavation met the undisturbed hillside was cool and slightly damp with the earth's own moisture, but not wet. The stone floor she had leveled with packed clay was firm underfoot. She lit the small iron stove constructed from a rusted cylinder she had found half buried in the rubble near the original shelter's far wall, fitted with a length of salvaged pipe for a chimney run through a stone sleeve in the roof. The fire took immediately. She fed it 3 pieces of the dense scrub oak and watched the temperature of the interior begin to rise. Not dramatically, not quickly, but steadily. The way things changed when the cold had to fight through 4 feet of earth rather than 1 inch of wood. After 20 minutes, she checked the candle. The flame stood perfectly straight, undisturbed. The shelter was not simply warm, it was still. She was sitting on the stool she had built from salvaged boards, eating a potato she had roasted in the coals, when she remembered the box and nearly tipped the stool over standing up. She had found it 9 days ago, tucked so far into the back corner of the excavation that she had almost shoveled past it. A wooden box roughly the size of a bread loaf wrapped in tar paper that had degraded but not entirely failed in its purpose. She had set it on the rough shelf she had cut into the sidewall and then buried herself in the roof problem and not thought of it again. Now she took it down and set it on the table. The nails were hand-cut iron, the kind used before machine manufacture became standard. This box had gone into the ground before 1870, possibly well before. She worked the lid with the tip of the hand drill, careful the wood soft enough in places that too much pressure would collapse it. The lid came free. Inside oilcloth wrapped around 3 objects. A folded letter, the paper brown at the edges, the ink faded but legible. A small surveyor's notebook with a stiff cover. A document printed on heavier paper bearing a territorial seal. She read the document first. It was a mineral survey report filed with the Office of the Surveyor General of New Mexico Territory, dated June 14, 1871. The surveyor was a man named A.J. Prentice, working under contract. The land described matched Devil's Notch by its boundary markers. She recognized the reference points from her own deed. The survey recorded the presence of a silver-bearing quartz vein running northwest to southeast through the lower granite layer of the parcel, estimated at modest but commercially viable depth. Not a bonanza, not the kind of strike that renamed a town, but real, documented, officially recorded in 1871, and based on the condition of this box, never submitted to the Public Record Office. Old Crockett had buried it. She read the letter next. It was addressed to Dale, not to any lawyer or bank in Crockett's spare, unpracticed handwriting. It had never been sent. Crockett had discovered the survey report had gone missing from the territorial office shortly after it was filed, not officially, not with any explanation, simply absent from the record where it should have been. He suspected someone with connections to the county seat had arranged the disappearance. He did not name the someone, but he wrote that a man from Caldera Flats had come to him twice offering to buy the land at prices that made no sense for ground publicly regarded as worthless. He had refused. He was bearing the report to keep it from the same hands that had taken the original. He intended to send Dale a letter explaining where to find it. He had died evidently before sending it. Wren sat with the papers on the table for a long time without moving. Harlan Voss had known about the silver since at least the early 1870s. He had waded through Crockett's life, waded through Dale's ownership, waded through Dale's death, dressed his face in manufactured sympathy, and offered a grieving widow $50 for 40 acres of documented mineral claim. The mountain had not been his only patience. He had been practicing it for over a decade. The cold outside pressed against the stone facing of her door. Inside, the stove ticked quietly as the iron adjusted to heat. She folded the territorial document carefully, wrapped it back in the oilcloth, placed it inside her coat against her skin, where the warmth of her own body would keep it dry. Then she picked up Ezra's work gloves from the shelf, pulled them on, opened the door, stepped back out into the November wind, and went to collect the last load of turf she needed to finish sealing the roof. Whatever Harlan Voss had been waiting for, she was not going to give it to him. The work was not done. The roof needed 2 more hours of turf laying. The door frame needed weather stripping packed into its gaps. She needed to build a proper shelf for the water bucket and cut a drainage channel along the downhill edge of the floor to handle any moisture intrusion in spring thaw. There was always more work. Work was not the problem. She packed the last section of turf into place with her palms, tamping it down against the soil beneath, feeling it settle into the solid mass of the roof's insulating layer. The sky above Dagger Ridge was holding its color past the point where it usually went gray, a deep blue-purple in the west that looked borrowed from a different latitude. The first stars were out. The widow's breath had dropped to almost nothing, as if it too had spent itself for the day. She sat at the edge of the roof and looked down at the valley where Caldera Flats was settling into its evening lights, small yellow squares in the dark orderly, comfortable, each one representing a family that had never considered the possibility that the ground beneath their feet was warmer than the air above it. Somewhere in that arrangement of lights, Harlan Voss was sitting in a well-heated room with good furniture, reviewing accounts, absolutely certain that the mountain would take care of his problem for him before spring. She climbed down off the roof, went inside, closed the door, lit the candle. The flame stood straight. She had in her coat a document that changed the nature of everything she was doing up here. Not just survival now, but contest the kind with legal teeth. She would need to be careful with it. She would need to be certain. She set a pot of beans on the stove, sat down on her stool and listened to the widow's breath pick back up outside, finding the ridgeline working its way across the exposed stone with its familiar patient insistence. The walls held the sound at bay. The earth above her head held the cold at bay. The fire needed only a little wood to do what fires in wooden houses consumed entire cords trying to achieve. She had not conquered anything. She had simply listened to what the mountain already knew. The sky changed on a Monday. Wren knew it before she had a name for what she was seeing. She had stepped outside at first light to check the drainage channel she had cut along the downhill edge of the floor, and she looked north out of habit, the direction that mattered on Dagger Ridge, and stopped moving. The horizon was wrong. Not dark wrong, not storm gray wrong, but a color she had no precise word for, the particular shade of pewter that has been worked too long and lost its shine. Flat in a way that had nothing to do with cloud cover. The sky was not threatening. It was decided. She stood outside for 10 minutes watching it. The widow's breath had gone entirely still. In 3 weeks on the mountain, she had not experienced a single morning without wind. The silence where the wind had been was not peaceful. It was the silence of a room where someone has just stopped speaking, the kind that makes you aware of how much had been filling the air before. She went back inside, checked her food stores, checked the wood piles she had stacked along the interior wall, checked the seal on the door. Then she went back out, climbed to the ridge above the shelter, looked south toward the valley. Caldera Flats was already moving differently. She could see it even at this distance. The accelerated small motion of people carrying things, boarding things, moving livestock. The town had read the same sky and drawn the same conclusion. She had 11 days of food if she was careful, 2 weeks of fuel for the stove if she burned it small. The roof had been sealed for a week. The door fit its frame as tightly as her tools allowed. She had done what could be done. She went inside, set a pot of water to heat, sat on her stool, and waited for the storm to tell her what it was. It told her at dusk. The wind came back all at once, not building gradually the way wind usually built, but arriving fully formed as if it had gathered itself somewhere north of the territory line and traveled the distance without bothering to announce itself until it was already here. The sound it made against the exterior of her shelter was nothing like what she had expected, which was the point. She had expected the thin, penetrating shriek she heard every other night through the canvas of the tent. What she heard instead was a low, muffled roar, distant, seeming like a river heard from the far side of a hill. The earth above her head absorbed the frequency. The stone facing took the direct impact and distributed it into the hillside. The door shuddered once in its frame, then held. She lit a second candle and watched both flames. Neither moved. Outside, the temperature was dropping at a rate she could feel in the quality of the silence. Cold has a sound, a compression of air, a settling. Inside, the stove was burning 3 pieces of scrub oak, which was less than she had used on any night since she moved in. The walls did not require defending. They simply held. She fell asleep sitting up on her stool, her back against the packed earth wall, and did not dream. Ezra Pruitt's roof failed at midnight. She did not know this until later, but the sequence of events reconstructed itself clearly enough afterward. The north-facing pitch of his farmhouse roof had been built 30 years ago by a man who understood New Mexico winters as they had existed in the 1850s. Hard, yes, but within a range. What came down on that Monday night was not within a range. The snow accumulated at a rate the pitch was not designed to shed, the wet, heavy kind that packs rather than slides, and the main rafter on the north face cracked under a load it had no structural argument against. The crack woke Ezra. The cascade of snow and splintered lumber that followed drove him to the south corner of the main room where the ceiling was still intact. His fire was alive but failing. The chimney, partially blocked by debris from the collapsed section, was not drawing properly. The room was cooling at a rate that a man his age and his condition, sitting in wet clothes in a corner with a dog pressed against his side, could survive for perhaps 4 hours. He did not think about being rescued. He thought about the candle, the specific image he had carried in his mind since the day he had stood inside Wren's shelter. A flame that did not move in a room where a blizzard was happening 30 feet above it. He had turned it over in his mind the way you turn a stone over to see what lives beneath it, looking for the flaw, the trick, the element of fortune that explained the result. He had not found one. The candle simply did not move because the air in the room did not move, because the room was insulated by a mass of earth that the storm could not penetrate in the time available to it. There was no flaw. There was no fortune. It was physics old as the continent. He sat in his corner with his dog and thought she was right. The cold worked at the room. He thought she was entirely right, and I sat on a rock and watched her bleed through her gloves and said almost nothing useful. He thought, if I stay here, I will not see morning. He dressed in everything he could reach that was dry. He found his walking staff where it had always leaned against the doorframe. He opened the door into the storm and stepped out. Wren woke at what her body told her was somewhere around 3 in the morning. No sound had woken her, that was the point. The absence of any alarming sound had allowed her to sleep deeply for the first time in weeks, and she woke now not from distress, but from simple completion of rest. She lay on her bedroll and listened to the muffled roar of the storm working the ridge above her. She was thinking about the mineral survey document. She needed to take it to Santa Fe. Not to a lawyer in Caldera Flats. Any lawyer in Caldera Flats operated within the gravitational field of Harlan Voss's money, but to the territorial surveyor's office directly where the document would become part of a public record that no private banker could cause to go missing a second time. She had been waiting until the shelter was fully sealed, until she had completed the work that made the shelter viable as a winter dwelling. The shelter was viable. What she had now was not nothing. She had the shelter. She had the document. She had survived weeks of Dagger Ridge winter alone in a structure that the rest of the county had been informed was her grave. These were not nothing. They were, in fact, exactly the currency that the territorial office would recognize. Not sentiment, not grievance, but a valid claim backed by a legitimate document presented by a woman who could demonstrate that she had the tenacity to press the claim to its conclusion. She was working through the specific language she would use at the territorial office when she heard something outside that did not fit the storm. Not a sound exactly. A disruption in the way the storm sounded, a pattern change at close range, rather than the uniform roar she had been sleeping through. Then something striking the stone facing of the door. Not wind, not debris, a rhythm that was irregular in the specific way that exhausted human effort is irregular. She was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand her hand on the door bar, listening. Then the striking came again. She lifted the bar, pulled the door inward against the pressure of packed snow on its exterior, put her shoulder into it. The door opened 8 inches before it met the resistance of drifted snow. She forced it to 12 and looked out. The storm hit her face like a thrown handful of broken glass. In the narrow band of light that reached past her into the dark, she saw him. Ezra Pruitt on his knees in the snowdrift that had built against her door, his staff across his lap, his face so thoroughly coated in ice that she could not read his expression, only his eyes, which were open. She could not get the door open further against the drift. She took hold of his coat with both hands and pulled him toward the gap, pulled until the door opening was full of him, pulled until he was over the threshold. She threw her weight against the door, got it shut against the wind, dropped the bar. The muffled roar returned. She looked at what the storm had delivered. He was alive, breathing in the specific, careful way of someone whose body has made significant decisions about resource allocation, shallow, steady, committed to the minimum. She moved fast in the way you move when deliberation is a luxury the situation is not offering. The stove got 2 more pieces of wood. She pulled her second blanket off the bedroll, wrapped it around him from the outside of his coat, tucked it under him to get the blanket between his body and the cold floor. The pot of water from the morning's heating was still warm at the back of the stove, not hot warm exactly right. She put his hands around it. He could not grip it. She held his hands around it herself. He did not speak for 20 minutes. She did not ask him to. The color came back into his face in stages, not a sudden reversal, but a slow reclamation. The body deciding one system at a time that it could stand down from emergency management. When his hands could grip the mug, she refilled it with hot water. He drank it in small, careful amounts. Finally, Roof went. His voice had the quality of something retrieved from a significant distance. She waited. Couldn't stay. Cold was coming in too fast. He looked around the interior of the shelter, not the searching look of a man reassessing, but the slower recognition of a man confirming something he had already worked out in his own mind during the walk through the storm. Yours held. Yours would have held too if it had 4 feet of earth above it, Wren told him with no particular satisfaction in the statement. It was simply true. He was quiet for a long time, holding the mug, looking at the earthen wall. The storm worked the ridge above them. Inside, the candle on the shelf burned without a tremor, its flame a vertical line of steadiness in the still air. I told myself you were grief crazy. He did not apologize for it. He stated it the way a man states an error in calculation, not with shame, but with the precision of someone correcting the record. Easier to think that than to think I'd been building wrong for 30 years. You built what everyone built. She refilled his mug. Everyone built wrong for the same reasons. The reasons made sense from the outside. He looked at her across the small table. Something had shifted in his face. Not gratitude exactly, though that was present. More like the expression of a man who has been carrying a fixed idea for a long time and set it down somewhere on the road through the storm. What made you certain enough to try? She thought about it honestly. I wasn't certain. I was out of alternatives. The storm raged for 2 more days. On the second day, she told him about the document. She took it from the oilcloth, set it on the table between them. He read it slowly with his whole attention. When he finished, he set it down, looked at it for a moment, looked at her. He knew the whole time. Not a question. Before Dale and I ever arrived in Colfax County, Wren confirmed. Ezra turned the document over carefully as if checking for something on the back. You'll take this to Santa Fe. When the storm breaks, yes. He put the document back on the table. His jaw was set in the way of a man who has just moved something from one column to another in an internal ledger. I'll come with you. She shook her head. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. He looked at her steadily. I sat on a rock above your excavation for 10 minutes before I helped you move one stone. I've been leaving potatoes at the bottom of the trail like you were a stray animal. I wasn't sure about feeding. I'm done being cautious about which side of this I'm on. She did not argue with him further. Some decisions deserve to be accepted without qualification. The storm broke on the third morning, not gradually, but with the clean decisiveness of something that had finished its work. The silence was different from the pre-storm silence. This was the silence of aftermath of a landscape that had been rearranged and was now taking stock of itself. Wren opened the door. The snow had drifted to 6 feet against the stone facing, burying the lower half of the door. She pushed through it with the shovel cutting a channel. When she emerged fully onto the surface of the drift, she stood at almost the height of her own roofline, looking out over a transformed Dagger Ridge. The scrub oak had disappeared to their upper branches. The trail down to the valley was a white absence. The sky above was the particular blue that only appears after a significant storm has cleared, the kind of blue that has no warmth in it but perfect clarity. The damage in the valley was evident even from a distance. 3 roof lines were wrong, 2 with visible collapse, 1 with a section simply gone. Smoke came from some of the chimneys, thin and effortful, the smoke of fires that had been working extremely hard for 3 days. As she watched tiny figures move between the buildings, with the deliberate movement of people digging out from under something that had nearly covered them entirely. Ezra appeared beside her, having managed the door with better technique than she had expected. He looked down at the valley with the expression of a man who understands that the same lesson is expensive no matter who pays for it. Old Hendricks, he said quietly, naming a man who lived alone in the northwest corner of the settlement. She knew the name. An elderly man, widowed, living on what little he had. He was on his last cord of wood before the storm started. She did not answer because there was no answer to give. They made it down the mountain in 3 hours, breaking trail through snow that came to Wren's hip in the drifted sections, Ezra ahead of her, with his staff working as a probe, both of them moving at the pace the terrain set rather than the pace urgency wanted. When they reached the edge of Caldera Flats and began moving between the buildings, people stopped to look at them. At first they looked at Ezra because Ezra was a man they expected to find in his farmhouse, not walking out of a drift from the direction of Dagger Ridge. When the connections assembled themselves, Ezra coming from the mountain, which meant he had been with the woman in the pit, the looking shifted. She was aware of it without meeting it directly. She kept moving toward the bank building, where a cluster of men had gathered. She was looking for Harlan Voss. She found him at the edge of the group vest. Immaculate coat without a single tear boots, showing no evidence of having walked through anything more demanding than a swept floor. He had managed the storm from within adequate walls, which was his right. He was speaking to the county clerk, something about property assessment, the tone of a man taking an administrative inventory of an opportunity. She walked to within 10 feet of him and stopped. He saw her. The administrative expression shifted first to surprise, then to the managed warmth he kept for situations that required management. "Mrs. Calloway, you're alive." Framed as relief, the arithmetic behind it was something else entirely. "I am." She reached inside her coat and removed the oilcloth packet. She did not unwrap it yet. "I'd like you to look at something." The group of men had shifted to include this exchange without appearing to do so, the way men in small communities absorb significant moments through peripheral attention. Ezra stood a few feet behind her left shoulder, his staff planted, saying nothing. She unwrapped the document on the flat surface of a hitching post beside them. The territorial seal was visible from several feet away, the formal header of an official survey report, its age apparent from the paper's color, its authority apparent from the layout. She watched Harlan Voss's face as his eyes moved over it. The managed warmth did something she had not expected, not collapse but freeze. Not theatrical. The actual stillness of a man whose decade of patience has just been shown to have been less complete than he believed. "This is the mineral survey your people removed from the territorial office in 1871. Wren said, her voice level, carrying only as far as the immediate group. The one that documented a viable silver vein beneath Devil's Notch before you began making offers to Crockett Calloway, before you waited for Dale to die, before you came to my door with $50. She folded the document carefully, returned it to the oilcloth. I'm taking it to Santa Fe. I wanted you to know that I have it, so that there's no ambiguity later about what I knew. The county clerk had gone very still beside Voss, reading the document's header, with the focused attention of a man whose professional instincts had just been activated. Harlan Voss said nothing for a moment that lasted long enough to answer every question anyone present might have had about the accuracy of what Wren had just stated. When he spoke, his voice had lost its warmth entirely, not hostile, simply factual in the way that a man speaks when he has discarded the instrument that no longer serves. That document's provenance will be disputed. By all means dispute it, Wren told him. The Territorial Office has the original survey registration number on file. The surveyor A.J. Prentice is listed in the Territorial Registry as resident in Taos. She had read the name on the document, found the registry reference in the surveyor's notebook buried alongside it, and verified the detail before she left the shelter that morning. I checked before I came down. Ezra's voice came from behind her left shoulder, quiet, carrying the authority of 60 years of accurate observation. She survived 3 days in a structure she built with her own hands while 2 roofs caved in down here. She walked off that mountain this morning through 8 feet of drift. Whatever you think she doesn't know, Harlan, I'd revise that estimate. Voss looked at Ezra. He looked at the county clerk, whose expression had become professionally neutral in the specific way that signals institutional distance being established. He looked at the small group of men who had arranged themselves into witnesses without intending to. He put his hat back on his head. He walked back to the bank building without another word, and the door closed behind him with a sound that was not quite a slam, not quite a composed close, but something between them that told its own story. She rode to Santa Fe 6 weeks later in January of 1884 on a horse she bought from the livery stable with money borrowed from Ezra against the future value of the claim, a formal arrangement written down, witnessed by Amos Fitch at the postal office. The journey took 3 days each way on roads that were still difficult from the storm's aftermath. She stayed in a boarding house on the south side of the capital, ate simply, slept well. Rose before dawn on the second day to be at the Territorial Surveyor's office when it opened. The Territorial Surveyor was a small man with precise habits, a carefully maintained desk, a manner that communicated through the quality of his attention rather than any outward display of it. He read the document she laid before him. He compared its registration number against his office's index. The original registration was present, filed in 1871 and never formally withdrawn. The associated claim action had simply never been pursued. He examined the surveyor's notebook, cross-referenced the name A.J. Prentice against the Territorial Registry, confirmed the man was listed as a working surveyor of record. He read Crockett's letter, which she had brought as corroborating context. He looked at the deed she had filed with Amos Fitch in October. He picked up his pen. The claim registration is valid under the Mining Act of 1866. Your deed supersedes any subsequent unregistered interest. He wrote for a moment, then looked up. I'll need the filing fee for the formal claim activation. $2. She set 2 silver dollars on his desk. He stamped the document, entered the claim number in the index, made a copy for his files, returned the original to her with his signature across the bottom. Congratulations, Mrs. Calloway. You have a silver claim. She rode back to Caldera Flats in weather that had decided to be reasonable. The document in her coat, the horse moving at its own preferred pace along the Rio Grande corridor. She did not feel triumphant. Triumph was a large emotion that required a certain amount of leisure to sustain, and she did not have leisure by disposition. What she felt was the specific satisfaction of a thing completed correctly, the same sensation she had felt running her palm along the front wall of the shelter when the last course of stone locked into place. One evening the following autumn, Ezra Pruitt climbed the trail to visit, not for any practical reason, simply to sit on the flat rock outside her door and drink coffee from the tin cups she had acquired when she stopped improvising and admitted she intended to be here permanently. The evening was clear, the air beginning its seasonal sharpening, the valley below going golden in the low-angle light. He looked out over the valley for a long while without speaking. She let the silence be what it was. Between people who have been through something serious together, silence is not empty. I've been thinking, he said at last, about the 10 minutes I stood above your pit before I said anything useful. She looked at him. You said something useful eventually. A man my age ought to be past making people prove themselves before he helps them. He was looking at the valley, not at her, which was the way he said things that cost him something to say. Took me watching you go through a blizzard on your knees to get there. She picked up her coffee cup. The evening light was doing something particular to the color of the stone on the ridge above them, turning the gray to amber, finding warmth in the material that was always present, but only visible at certain angles. You came back down the mountain with me, she told him. You stood where you stood. That's not a small thing. He considered that, drank his coffee. The dog that had survived the storm with him lay at his feet, monitoring the middle distance with the professional attention of a dog who had learned that the world could change without announcement. That autumn marked the beginning of what became visible the following spring. 3 families who had lost roofs in the December storm came to rent in March when the ground was soft enough to work again. They came with the specific directness of people who have decided to set aside their embarrassment in the interest of not repeating a costly mistake. They did not ask for charity. They asked to be shown. She showed them. She worked alongside them, not directing from a distance, not lecturing about theory, but standing in the excavations with them, her hands on the stones, demonstrating what she had learned in the particular vocabulary of demonstration, which is the only language that truly transfers knowledge about physical things. Each family's shelter was adjusted to the specific geology of its site, the specific needs of the family occupying it. She taught them to read the ground before they committed to a design, to find where the Earth's temperature was most stable, to think of the landscape as a partner rather than a problem to be solved against. By summer of 1884, 4 earth-sheltered structures stood on the slopes above Caldera Flats, their turf roofs greened with the rains, their occupants moving between them on paths worn naturally into the hillside, created without planning, the thing that communities create when they have found a shared method, not just proximity, but belonging. The knowledge that the solutions available to your neighbor are available to you, that the wisdom one person bought dearly has been made common currency. The silver vein was modest. She hired 2 men that same spring to open it properly, paid them fair wages from the first proceeds, worked the operation herself for 2 seasons before the yield tapered to a maintenance level. It never made her wealthy. It made her free, which was the only form of wealth she had ever needed to calculate. Harlan Voss left Caldera Flats in the spring of 1885. She heard through the county clerk that his banking license had been reviewed by territorial authorities following questions about the 1871 survey document's disappearance from the public record. The review produced no criminal charge. The territory's legal mechanisms for pursuing that kind of organized malfeasance were imprecise at best, but the attention of the territorial office directed at his operations was enough. He moved to Albuquerque. No one in Caldera Flats wrote to him. People stopped calling the land Devil's Notch. Not through any official decision, not through the posting of a new name on a sign, but through the organic shift of language that happens when a place acquires an identity that supersedes its old reputation. They called it Callaway Notch. She did not ask them to, had not sought it, found it faintly uncomfortable when she thought about it directly. But she understood that it was not about her name. It was about the fact that the notch was no longer a punchline. It was an answer. The name simply recorded that someone had found the answer there first. The widow's breath came through the ridge that autumn evening, lighter than it had been in October of the year before, carrying the particular temperature of a season in transition. She could hear it above. Down here in the partial shelter of the notch, it was a sound rather than a force. She picked up a piece of granite from the ground beside the flat rock, a fragment from the original excavation, a small irregular piece with one flat face that caught the light in an interesting way. Ruth used to carry a stone. Something about the way the earth held its history in its material, the way stone recorded what soil forgot. She turned it over in her palm, then carried it inside and set it on the table where it would stay dry. The valley below went slowly from gold to shadow. The stars arrived the way they always arrived on clear nights in New Mexico, not one at a time, but all at once, as if they had been there all along, waiting for the sky to get dark enough to make them visible. Ezra finished his coffee. She finished hers. They sat in the comfortable quiet of people who have found they can be honest with each other, which is the hardest thing to find, harder than silver, worth more when the vein runs deep. The cold came down off the ridge, slowly feeling its way. The shelter behind her held its temperature without effort, the way all true things hold, not by force, not by fighting what pressed against them, but by being at their core, something the cold could not locate and therefore could not take. She had not defeated the mountain. She had not defeated Harlan Voss, not exactly, not in the way stories like to be resolved. She had simply outlasted the idea that a woman with nothing had nothing to work with. The ground had always been warm below the freeze line. The document had always been buried below the rubble. The answer had always been present, waiting for someone willing to dig past the surface of what everyone agreed was true. Ruth would have said something practical, would have said that the earth does not give you what you want. It gives you what you are willing to get cold enough to look for. Wren stood up from the flat rock, collected the cups, looked once more at the darkened valley before she went inside. Some things you do not conquer. You learn their language, meet them where they are, bring what you have, find the warmth that was already there waiting. The rest is just work. The rest is just showing up in the dark with a shovel, asking the right question of the ground beneath your feet. She went inside. She closed the door. The flame on the table stood straight and unwavering, burning in air that did not move because the walls held, because the earth held, because she had listened when everyone else was busy talking about why listening was useless. The widow's breath crossed the ridge above and moved on south, looking for something it could reach. It did not find what it was looking for here.